the Disability Reference Group, and in which we will be looking at the latest technical resources, tools, and technical support developments translating existing inclusion guidance into action. My name is Christian Modino. I am one of the co-chairs of the Disability Reference Group, and it is my pleasure to moderate this session today. Before jumping into the substance of the session, just a few housekeeping considerations. The session will be entirely in English, but we are providing captioning, so please check the chat box to access the link. We are also providing sign language interpretation. The session is being recorded, so you will be able to access the recording in due course through the HNPW platform after the event. There will be space for questions, so please post any you may have for the panelists in the chat box, which we will be monitoring regularly. And if you want to make a contribution from the floor in the interactive part of the session, please raise your hand and request to be unmuted in advance using the chat box, so our logistics team can enable the function for you to speak. Okay, so the session today is divided in three main parts, in which we will hear on one hand about the current and upcoming initiatives to strengthen capacity of humanitarian actors. Then we will share some examples of recently developed practical new tools and resources to strengthen disability inclusion in humanitarian action. And finally, we will move into a theme where we will be exchanging on options for strengthening the availability of technical support in disability inclusion in emergencies. So I will let our distinguished panelists introduce themselves as they speak, but not without first thanking them in advance for their availability and accepting sharing their experience and work with us today. Thank you again. So without further ado, I'm going now to hand over to Nadia Haddad from the European Disability Forum for some introductory remarks from the perspective of OPDs in the Ukraine response. So Nadia, the floor is all yours.
Good morning to you all. First of all, thank you very much to inviting the European Disability Forum to be part of this very important topic. So as an organization defending the rights of persons with disabilities, the European Disability Forum is very pleased to participate again and would like to highlight at this early point in proceeding how important it is that we are meaningfully involved in all humanitarian actions. So involving OPDs is obligatory under the United Nations Convention of the Right of Persons with Disabilities. But at particular level, our knowledge, experience, and networks are essential to our work as humanitarians, as we aim to leave no one behind. So over the last 12 months, the European Disability Forum and its members in 8 countries, including Ukraine, have been implementing a disability inclusive response to the ongoing war. Most of our partners in this work of EDF members are therefore organizations of persons with disabilities. You can read more about this on our website. But in a summary, we have aimed to address immediate needs, to influence the wider humanitarian community, and to look to the long term, especially in building the strength and the resilience of the disability movement. We plan to continue this work in the coming months and years. But we learned a lot over the last 12 months, and many of the things that we already suspected have been reinforced through our experience. But first, let me get a step back. So in 2019, when the launch of the UN Interagency Standing Committee, IASC Guidelines on Disability Inclusion in Humanitarian Action was a key milestone toward ensuring the inclusion of persons with disabilities in emergency responses. This comprehensive document should be used by all humanitarian agencies, including governmental bodies and donors, to put policy into practice. The constant thread running through the IASC guidelines is the need for meaningful participation and partnership with and empowering of organizations of persons with disabilities. Chapter 5 is dedicated entirely to this topic. Having a real understanding of this chapter is therefore essential for any individual or organization that is serious about involving and reaching everyone in their humanitarian action. So coming back to our experience over the last year, EDF and its members have certainly been approached by humanitarian organizations for potential collaboration. So our main funding is from a humanitarian organization. Some of our members are officially collaborating with UN agency, and we have good examples of more specific cooperation in the field of advocacy towards cash and voucher assistance. So it is fair to say that we have seen a significant increase in the recent years and efforts to engage with organizations of persons with disability. And they are a specific example of this. However, we are very long away from meaningful and effective participation as laid out in the CRPD or in the IASC guidelines. All too often, organizations of persons with disabilities are approached with little warning, expected to stop whatever it is that they are doing. They are supposed to provide key information and context, and then not to be involved anymore in the further activities that are planned. So effective participation requires preparedism. Humanitarian and disability organizations should be speaking together and now already about a medium to long-term future. What is it that the disability organizations require in order to effectively engage on a sustainable basis? And what is it that humanitarian organizations require in order to be inclusive? The answers will include funding for recruitment of staff and long-term governance, cross-training between disability and humanitarian organizations, and structures, tools, and budget for data disaggregation, accessibility, and reasonable accommodation. So actively involve and ensure meaningful participation of representative organizations of persons with disabilities and their family at all stages of the decision-making process and at all levels of the implementation of all practical guidelines and tools. So inclusion must be central to prevention and preparedness for all future challenges. So to support meaningful participation, we need also to ensure that the needed reasonable accommodation are provided to attend and to participate. For example, like adaptive transport, personal assistance, longer preparation time to give feedback, to ensure that persons with disability can participate decently on equal level as all the others. So guarantee that all assistance provided, including cash assistance, is inclusive for persons with disability. So guarantee inclusive and accessible emergency responses, services, including accessible information and contact points, transportation and shelter and healthcare. Also, we need to develop methodologies for the collection of disaggregated data on their intersectionalism and risk, including sex, age, type of disability, and place, like those living in closed settings, like persons with disability living in institutions, or refugees with disabilities in closed center rooms, psychiatrics. So including local leaders and local civil society organizations and DPOs in decision-making on local and national and global space, especially on risk reduction budgets, spending at the local level. So strengthening the role of the local civil society organization using an all of society approach. So we need also to recognize additional barriers faced by persons with disability in emergencies situation, including pandemics, armed conflicts, and even wider disasters caused by climate change. So during the emergencies, we need to ensure immediate efforts are taken to identify people with disability in institutions and those at risk of institutionalization. So the IASC guidelines must be read together with the CRPD guidelines on deinstitutionalization, as they are also address deinstitutionalization in time of emergency. In situations like Ukraine, where large percentage of persons with disability were living in institutions before the war, humanitarian actors must be prepared to address this. So the answer exists, but they cannot be implemented by quick last-minute meetings in the middle of the crisis. We need to plan together now for long-term, and these plans must be made on equal footing in a dialogue that respect each other's strengths and opportunities for improvement. We need to apply together for significant and long-term funding, including the fields of building resilience, disaster risk reduction, and climate change. So as part of that building back better, the availability and accessibility of community support systems need to be guaranteed as grounded in human rights standards. National policies and programs must be mutually reinforced and tailored to the realities of the population that are meant to serve. So deinstitutionalization should be prioritized within emergency preparedness and responses plans with identified human and financial resources, protocols, and accountability clearly established. So our work in Ukraine and the neighboring countries has undoubtedly had an impact on all three objectives of our projects, but it has also clearly crystallized the needs for organization of people with disability to be recognized as humanitarian actors, involved early and engaged with a view to long-term partnership. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for your introductory remarks and for the powerful message behind those. You've clearly expressed the importance, which are reflected actually in the IASC guidelines of ensuring participation of OPDs, of the importance of data collection, identification of barriers, and building capacity of humanitarian actors to make sure that programs are really inclusive. So thank you so much. And exactly this is the purpose of this, this session, is really to look at what additional resources and tools are really needed to support humanitarian community in general, apply inclusive practices. Thank you so much. So on that note, I'm going now to hand over to Ulrike and Pauline from HI and IASC respectively, to make a presentation on the current and upcoming DRG initiatives to strengthen capacity of humanitarian actors. So Ulrike and Pauline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian, and yeah, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. So Ulrike and I are going to talk to you about the working group 1 of the DRG, working on operationalization of the IASC guideline on inclusion of persons with disability. So my name is Pauline Tivillier. I'm the Inclusion Technical Advisor for the IRC, and together with Ulrike, we co-chair this working group 1. So Ulrike, if you don't mind, I will let you share the slide. Thank you very much. I'm going to start. Thank you. I'm going to start by talking to you about the first initiative that we did through the working group 1, which was coming together with a learning pack on introducing disability inclusion into humanitarian action that was published earlier this year. Why the need for a training pack? I think Nadia outlined very well, intervention, why there is a need to kind of consolidate knowledge around disability inclusion. But we found, working with Working Group 1 members, that there was a need to support the authorization of the IASC guideline into humanitarian programming. So was the IASC guideline provide a wealth of information in a very important framework? We felt like there was a need to provide, using this framework, more support and resources. There was a demand from a learning tool for various humanitarian actors. Training did exist, but it was a bit patchy and not always widely available, and not always focusing on programming aspects, which we found were very important. And the idea was to enhance the capacity on disability inclusion based on the IASC guideline, but also to recognize linkages with gender and other cross-cutting priorities and programming approach, and really much strengthen that. So not produce something in isolation, but really seeing in the ecosystem, how does that work? So it was a very long and participatory process. So there was a lot of interagency collaboration, including participation of organization of persons with disability in the development process. We did build on existing material. As we said, they either existed publicly available, or some organizations had their own internal learning material that they kindly shared with us. And so we did review what was out there and work together on a mapping and a scoring process. The idea very much to avoid duplication and not reinvent the wheel, but also to build on what we knew worked from experience. We also structured the content according to the project cycle management and applying the first 4 must-do action from the IASC guidelines on inclusion of persons with disability, around data, around identification and removal of barrier, capacity strengthening and empowerment, and meaningful participation. And I think we recognize that this was a very, very big effort. So we've been using a consultant to kind of support the consolidation of the material and addressing the feedback from the members of Working Group 1. So the expertise in Working Group 1 and the diversity of the participants was a real strength. Thanks. So what we ended up with is 7 modules that are aligned to the IASC guidelines of inclusion of persons with disability that support learning and reflection and discussion around disability inclusive humanitarian action. So it's very much about applying to the project cycle management disability inclusion, and to strengthen understanding and skills on disability inclusion, again with a very strong focus on programming. We went with a modular approach because we felt that it was much easier to adapt by design to whatever time was available, pre-existing knowledge, context, sector, but also to strengthen linkages with other cross-cutting themes. So it's a training that is really can be delivered in many different ways. The facilitator guides provide a lot of helpful tips on how to adapt and how to contextualize, to shorten the module if less time is available. We've really tried to keep it practical, recognizing how trainings are often delivered in the humanitarian sector. It is available for everyone to download. So it's on the DRG website, which is hosted by IDEA. And I'm sure we can put the link in the chat for people to be able to access. For now, it's only available in English, but we're working on translation as we speak. I think Spanish and Ukrainian are currently on the way. And we are also very keen to gather sectoral adaptation made of this training, so we can start building a repository, so we can have a protection training, a WASH training, so the actors that work on different sectors are able to access content that's a bit more tailored to what they do. And we also keep monitoring the use of this training to identify what works well, but also potentially gaps and needs for future module. So for now, we've had questions around data, around how we can strengthen the intersectionality aspect, maybe links with the humanitarian program cycle, etc., etc. You can go to the next slide, please, Ulrike. So that's, I'll run quickly through the 7 module, just being mindful of time. They kind of span through everything that we need to know. It's kind of a pyramid. So we've got general instruction, introduction video, facilitator guide. We have the first module that's focused on the introduction to disability and the rights-based model. We have a second module that talks about the IASC guidelines, the policy context, and kind of try to unpack, especially the earlier chapter that are cross-cutting. Module 3 is around situating disability, including the wider humanitarian landscape. So here we focus on legal policies, framework, key stakeholder, and data. Then we move to module 4 on accessibility, universal design and reasonable accommodation. Very important concept, as Nadia highlighted in our intervention earlier. Module 5 is about the must-do action. So as I mentioned, data, removing barrier, capacity strengthening and empowerment, and meaningful participation. So here, as again, Nadia stretched earlier, it is really important to reflect on how to engage organization of person with disability and person with disability throughout the project cycle. So this is unpacked in module 5, but also in module 6 that looks at the different phase of project cycle management, from needs assessment to monitoring and evaluation, and unpack the 4 must-do action within that framework. So this one is very much about applying the must-do action to programming. And the last module on inclusive accountability to affected population. I'll go through this quickly. This is the same thing, but just showing that the learning is kind of on a pyramid. So we're building from very foundational knowledge to more technical or programming knowledge. The module can be seen as quite long, but as we said, they can easily be contextualized and adapted. Not all modules need to be taken as well. In the facilitator guide, we kind of provide recommendation on what we think are core module. You can go to the next slide, Enrique, please. So yeah, and I think I'll end there, Enrique, to give you enough time just to flag that we also have an e-learning coming that follows exactly the same structure, minus the module 6, which is focusing on a different phase of programming, because that was quite hard to translate in an interactive e-learning. That should be coming at the end of the month. So we will make sure that we share that with everyone as well. But now I'll leave the floor to Enrique to talk about the other exciting things we've been working on in working group 1, which is the call for good and promising practices. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Pauline. Yes, and to take over from Pauline, as our working group, which we are jointly co-leading, is really focusing on the operationalization of the IASC guideline. We also received a lot of requests to provide case studies and really real life examples from the humanitarian field on how the IASC guidelines can be applied. So thanks to some additional funding we acquired, we were able to discuss with our working group members on a call for good and promising practices, which was really with the overarching aim to address that gap on a lack of good practices around the IASC guidelines. And the objective we all agreed we wanted to work together on is to enhance learning opportunities and evidence based on the good practices from the field. And the particular focus again was also if we have already the training, but also really the must-do actions performing from our observation quite well in the field. We would want to see how those are applied in different sectors. We also wanted to ensure an approach within to achieve this objective that the call for good practice and the selection is really participatory, and I will speak later to that. The target group was really humanitarian actors from all sectors, and here, of course, of importance that really have the space currently to enhance their learning and want to improve their programming and reach, and who are willing to share in their learning on what works, what doesn't work with other humanitarian actors. The call closed on the 31st of March, and we've received 42 submissions, which made us quite happy and satisfied. And as I already mentioned, those are, and for all of us to remember, we split the 4 must-do actions into 5, so that we can have a closer look at quality, disability data collection, empowerment, capacity development of humanitarian actors, including, as pointed out by Nadia, of course, also organizations of persons with disabilities, identification and removal of barriers, and the meaningful participation of persons with disabilities. And what we can share already in terms of the profile, let's say, of the received good practices, and I hope we will really find a lot of inspiration from the submissions, and we can see that meaningful participation, we received 13 applications that had a focus on that. We also have a big focus on capacity development of humanitarian actors. So let's see what's really working in the field here. But equally important and work that seems to be ongoing is in the fields of identification and removal of barriers, as well as of empowerment of persons with disabilities in the crisis. And I guess that's really an area to tackle. We only have 4 submissions around enhancing the quality of data. So let's see as we go on with the reflection. Perhaps just a few words also to share around the sector, so we can see what is quite to be expected and maybe to be highlighted, at least within the English speaking submissions. We have a front runner, that is the protection sector, which perhaps is not surprising, as a lot of the humanitarian actors channel work to reduce discrimination and to enhance access to services via the protection sector. But we also have a fair share of all the other ones, from health to housing, land and property, but also gender-based violence, work around education and emergencies, as well as food security, to name the next ones which were addressed. Now, perhaps to share, and we have a few more minutes to share a little bit more about the process. So right now, we are going to meet today our technical selection committee to go a step further in selecting out of the 42 submission, 10 to 20, depending of course on the quality of the submission, a long list of good and promising practices. The practice holders who were submitting the 20 good practices will be invited to a selection workshop, and during that selection workshop, all of the submitting agencies will be invited to score each other and to identify those 3 good and promising practices. And I would call them at that stage then the best practices to be documented in depth in the form of the case study. All the other selected, maximum 20, good practices will be also shared as a brief of 2 pages, so that we can really encourage learning across the sectors, and also highlight opportunities for networking. If I'm looking for a particular sector and I'm interested what has been already done, what has worked, we will be able to share those briefs online and people can connect. We've asked all agencies that submitted a good practice to be willing to share their contact details, so that we really can create more of a network between those that are interested in learning and sharing. So after that, we will of course focus, and that should be latest by the end of this year, December, on the dissemination and publication of all 23 good and promising practices. There will be also a database with a summary and the contact details of the remaining 19 that were not selected for the full process. And then, of course, our ambition is to also follow up a little bit on the use. Was the format useful? Was it interesting for the participating agencies to learn about their own practice, to share, but also learn from the others? And hopefully, if all goes well, we shall start the next call. And with this one, I will share I will stop our presentation, and thank you very much on behalf of Working Group 1 for your attention. Thank you at this early hour. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Paulina and Ulrike. And it is only fair to say that the work that you've done with the Working Group 1 has been phenomenal over the past, I would say, 18 months or almost 2 years in coming up with this this training package, which was really a resource really needed in the sector. And I would really encourage participants to go through these materials at the link that has been shared in the chat box. You will see that it's very well organized, very interesting resources, and you will learn a lot. So thanks a lot. And we're really looking forward for the good practices in due course. We know that there is a big demand for more evidence and examples of good practices. So this is going to be really good. Before we move on to the next one, I see that there is a specific question that Milika Tukravska has asked in the chat box about when the sector-specific guidelines are going to be, to be launched. Do you want to react to that, Paulina or Ulrike?
I'm sorry, Christian, I was focusing on the chat.
Yes, so there is a...
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so the question in the chat is, when are the sector-specific guidelines going to be launched? Are you planning on further tailoring the trainings to working with persons with diverse impairments and with diverse characteristics?
So already we have a big focus on cross-disability within this one, and it's a bit on demand. So it's really interesting for you to hear from you. And we will inform through the DRG newsletter once we've put up the sector-specific ones online, or we have to figure out a way, as IDA is nicely hosting the DRG for now, how we can also present the repository. We know right now already sectorial adaptations are ongoing and are currently piloted in the field on food security, general protection, as well as WASH. So, and the languages, as Pauline mentioned, were Spanish and Ukraine. So we will inform through the DRG newsletter when they are available. And please do check also regularly the website.
Great, thank you so much, Ulrike. Good, so now we can then move on precisely to, to a session in which we'll be sharing some tools and resources that have been developed recently. So just a few examples, but then we can, exchange and have a conversation on what additional gaps we identify that will be important to keep in mind for further work in this area. So I'm going to then hand over now to Sarah Palmer from ELRA to introduce us to the innovation catalog that has been recently launched. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Christian, and thank you to the Disability Reference Group for convening this meeting and providing the opportunity for us to share. As Christian said, my name is Sarah Palmer, and I'm an Innovation Manager for the Humanitarian Innovation Fund at ELRA, leading our portfolio on disability and older age inclusion. As background, at the Humanitarian Innovation Fund, we aim to improve outcomes for people affected by crisis by identifying, nurturing and sharing more effective and scalable solutions. I'm really pleased to be able to share our innovation catalogue that was published just before Christmas. It includes an overview of all of the innovations focused on disability and older age inclusion that have been supported through the Humanitarian Innovation Fund. And we wanted to share the catalogue in this session, as we hope people can use the catalogue to explore the innovations and find valuable insights into the contextual barriers to inclusion, illustrating the complex intersections between disability and older age in different cultural contexts and humanitarian settings. The innovations...
Sarah, excuse me, are you intending to share your screen?
Yes, is it not sharing?
No, it's not sharing at the moment.
There we go.
Yes, now we can see.
Wonderful. We wanted to share the catalogue to hopefully provide the wider sector with opportunities to explore some of the innovations that have been funded. So I'll briefly give you an overview of how to explore and use the catalogue. So background is an introduction to the catalogue as part of our commitment to supporting problem-led and evidence-based innovation. In 2019, we commissioned a gap analysis on the inclusion of people with disabilities and older people in humanitarian response, which is now being used to inform the focus and prioritisation of the innovation challenges that we fund. So since 2019, innovations funded by the Humanitarian Innovation Fund have made a significant contribution towards addressing the gaps identified in the gap analysis. And the catalogue provides the range of innovations generated through this programme, many of which focus on gaining a deeper understanding of the problems which can then be used to underpin further innovation. So this slide shows a mapping of how the innovations funded have contributed towards addressing focus areas in the humanitarian inclusion standards and our gap analysis. And it shows where there have been the most contributions and where there are gaps and further work to do. And so this is a useful entry point to kind of look at before diving deeper into the catalogue. So an overview of what's covered within the catalogue. The catalogue is divided into the core themes where we have funded innovation challenges. So these include meaningful participation and localisation, inclusive preparedness, data-driven inclusion, improving accessibility, water sanitation and hygiene, WASH, and gender-based violence. And within this, you'll find innovation profiles describing the different projects, which include, for those of you who were able to attend the Disability Reference Group meeting on Monday, the Pioneer model in Indonesia, which has been led by IASB to build effective partnerships between humanitarian actors and organisations of persons with disabilities, to within the WASH portfolio, menstrual hygiene management friendly and accessible WASH facilities for emergencies, and guidance for how to develop those. So this slide shows an example of an innovation profile, and each innovation has the same format. Each profile refers to the humanitarian inclusion standards for disability and older age inclusion to which the project is contributing. And the catalogue aims to consolidate learning from the Humanitarian Innovation Fund grantees and provide an entry point for exploring innovations further. So each profile summarises the essence of the innovation, the problem it's trying to solve, how the innovation was tested, and what happens as a result, and what can be learned for future innovation. And we recognise that many of the interventions are dealing with complex and intersectional issues, which cannot be covered in full in these brief introductions in the catalogue. And so within the catalogue, there are also links to reports and resources that the innovators have developed, so that you're able to kind of go deeper and explore the findings and learnings further. So we hope that everyone on the call will explore the catalogue, and that it will be a catalyst for future innovations and learnings. So that's a brief overview from me, and yeah, I will share a link to the catalogue in the chat.
Yes, great. Thank you so much, Sarah. And me personally, again, a big thank you to ERA, having been involved in this program, and how we came about this catalogue has been a really good journey. And it's a great example also on how, you know, we can bring different experiences from different organizations in applying innovative approaches to disability inclusion through a grant mechanism such as the Innovation Fund from ERA. So again, thanks a lot. So we're going now to move to Kirsten from UNICEF, and also co-chair of the reference group, to share with us UNICEF Action Toolkit.
Great, thanks so much, Christian. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, is that working?
Yes, it is.
Yes, super, great. So thank you so much to all the speakers so far. It's really great to hear about all these tools that are being developed. I was just in another event yesterday, and I was also noting there that there's been such a shift since the first HNPW that I attended in terms of how disability inclusion is being addressed. We've really moved beyond the policy and general advocacy messaging, and what we're seeing a lot more now is this really strong focus on concrete practical tools, which is great. So what I'm going to be presenting very briefly today is a toolkit that was developed by UNICEF in partnership with CBM and CBM Inclusion Advisory Group. So up front, just a really big thank you to CBM and CBM Advisory Group for the great work that they've done on this toolkit. Oh, yeah, there we are. So the toolkit was developed in response to feedback that we were getting from a lot of our colleagues, and that I imagine that many of you are also hearing in your work, which is that it's great to have guidance. Guidance is really important, but it's not enough. What we need is practical, concrete tools, easy to use, that allows our colleagues in the field to apply that guidance in practice. So this particular toolkit was in response to the series of UNICEF guidance documents, guidance pieces that we have on disability inclusive humanitarian action. We've had this guidance for a few years now, but I think still relevant and useful. So I will share a link also to that shortly in the chat. Now the toolkit, I'll go through it in a little bit more detail, but basically it's a set of short guidance documents, tip sheets, practical tools, training materials, etc. Again, to support implementation of those more detailed guidance documents. They're intended to be used by humanitarian actors on the ground in all phases of humanitarian response, also in emergency preparedness. They're relevant both to programming and to coordination, as well as to monitoring of humanitarian response. It also is a live toolkit. So we're constantly updating based on feedback that we get. We're also constantly adding new tools to the toolkit. So for example, at the moment, we're working on a short guide on disability inclusive preparedness. We're also planning to develop in the interagency space a short note on disability inclusive post-disaster needs assessment, just as two examples. Now, what is inside the toolkit, as I mentioned, and I will go through in a little bit more detail, is a toolbox, a set of checklists, as well as training materials. So going first to the toolbox, we have a number of different pieces in the toolbox. We have a tip sheet on how to get started on disability inclusion in humanitarian action. So this is really intended for that person, that humanitarian actor who goes into an emergency, whether it's a new emergency or protracted, regardless of where they are in the humanitarian program cycle, and who asks themselves, how do I begin? What should I do? I know I need to strengthen disability inclusion in this response. How do I do it? We also have a tip sheet on how to concretely and practically engage with organisations of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action. This is something that everybody very much agrees is a top priority for everybody. It's essential. It's a core part of our work, but we often get a question on how do you do this? We also have a tip sheet on disability inclusion in accountability to affected populations. So how do we ensure we're engaging with affected populations in an inclusive way? How do we ensure that complaints and feedback mechanisms are accessible? These kinds of issues. Now, moving on to cluster coordination, we also have a short guide on how to ensure that cluster coordination is disability inclusive. This tool is more like a checklist and really specific to those coordination functions. Also on coordination, we have a short guide on interagency coordination at a country level. So this sets out some tips for setting up a disability focal point network or for running a disability working group, for example. And very important to this guide is that OPDs should very much be at the centre of those working groups. We also have a short guide on a question that we get all the time, which is on budgeting and mobilising resources for disability inclusion. So how do we budget in an inclusive way How do we communicate with donors in a way to raise funds that are needed to ensure disability inclusion? Now, on this slide, I just have two examples of two of our tools. I won't spend too much time on this one. On the left-hand side, what we have is an example of the tool that I mentioned on interagency coordination on disability inclusion at country level. It shows the purpose of the guide, and it just shows that this guide covers both disability working groups and focal points. On the right-hand side, we then have the tool that I covered briefly on how to get started on disability inclusion in humanitarian action. And what that shows is that there are tips on how to prepare yourself, how to ensure that persons with disabilities are on the agenda of the humanitarian response, how to create entry points for disability inclusion, and how to ensure that persons with disabilities and disability inclusion is kept visible in planning, in budgeting, in different coordination processes. Now, in terms of our checklists, these are again intended to be very practical, user-friendly. We have checklists in a number of different sectors, including nutrition, education, child protection, WASH, and we also have a general checklist. Now, these checklists address the humanitarian program cycle, all phases, and they also highlight actions that are relevant to coordination and preparedness, which cut across all phases of the cycle. I'll share links to all of these in the chat shortly. Now, lastly, what we have, the final component of the toolkit, is two training modules, two training resources. So the first one is a 2-hour training. This is meant to be delivered by a facilitator. It includes both PowerPoint and other resources, including a facilitator guide. And that's a basic training package on how to include children with disabilities in humanitarian action. It's been designed to be delivered online, but there are also tips for how to very easily adapt it for the face-to-face facilitation mode. Secondly, we have an online training module, so self-paced, independent training module for 50 minutes on disability inclusive coordination. So this is more intended for cluster coordinators, information managers, others involved in cluster coordination. And you can find that in the toolkit as well. This is actually on Agora, and this was developed by the UNICEF cluster coordination section, but we've included it as part of the toolkit just to be easily accessible to everybody. And that is it. I will stop there, very brief, but I will share links in the chat and encourage everybody to have a look, and please feel free to reach out in case of any questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Kirsten. There's actually one question from Isabel in the chat box. If you could please clarify if the guide is open to all or accessible only to UNICEF staff.
The guide is open to all. Some of the resources like the budgeting, it is more relevant to UNICEF internal, and some of the components of the training are also more relevant to UNICEF internal, but it is open to all. And definitely the cluster coordination, open to everybody, relevant to everybody working in coordination. I hope that helps to clarify.
Yeah. Great, thank you. And maybe just a note also for participants to know that one of the things that in the DRG we are trying is on a monthly basis through our newsletter, we publicize these new materials that are being developed. So we really encourage DRG members and beyond to share with us any tools that they are developing or any new good practice that they are developing, so that we can share through our newsletter, which is widely distributed. So thank you. Good. So let's move to then the third example of tools and resources recently being developed. So I'm going to hand over now to Donia Pavone from IOM to share with us the decision tree on disability data in humanitarian context. Donia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian. Hi, everybody. As Christian said, I work for DTM, which is part of the Global Data Institute of IOM. And I'm going to briefly talk about a tool that we have developed together with colleagues from an advisor group to the FCDO single business case. And that deals with how do you identify the data you need and how do you collect the data you need? Data has been mentioned today already a few times. Nadia and Ulrike, as well as Sarah, mentioned them. The origin and the reason why we developed this tool is because we often hear about the importance of data, but often people might equate data with number of persons with disability. So data for disability inclusion are much broader than that. And so we realized there was a need for at least a very brief overview of the type of data that are necessary in order to build inclusive programming, but also how each type of data could be collected. What we try to do always when we work on data is we try to identify first the purpose, the use, the action, the decisions that are going to be made. And that's a good starting point for colleagues that find themselves in a situation in which they need data, they think they need data, but the first thing that they can do is to identify what type of data for what purpose. So I'll give you a brief example. If we need to understand and overcome barriers to access for persons with disabilities to goods and services in an emergency, first we need to understand the barriers. And so the data we need are going to be data about barriers to accessing the individual goods and services for the specific groups. And the way we collect those in a safe and appropriate manner is going to be through not counting people, so not data and numbers of persons with disabilities, but through interviews with OPDs, interviews with key informants, and eventually other types of methodologies that we can have at our disposal. So the decision tree is going to be available on the links that I just shared with you there. It's going to be available on the DTM and Partners Toolkit and hopefully on other websites. And it's, again, as Christian was mentioning before, these are open tools to everybody to use, and everybody can have them and distribute them, disseminate them. It is done with the purpose of serving the wider humanitarian community, help them see what type of data they need and then how to collect the individual data. We also have an e-learning available for everybody on an open platform. It's also in the chat. I just put it in. We have a little video that explains, guides people through how to identify the type of data they need and what to use in order to collect that information. And we have a session coming up next week for the HNPW, specifically on data for disability inclusion on Thursday afternoon Geneva time, that you're all very much invited to participate. I think I'm going to stop here just with the invitation to always think of the purpose and the action that is going to be taken before we identify the type of data we need when we work with data for disability inclusion, but also when we work on any other type of data and information. Thank you very much. Over.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, Donia. So we've just had or listened to 3 examples of resources and tools that exist, but I'm very conscious that there is a whole plethora of materials, of literature related to disability inclusion. It's very difficult often for practitioners to navigate all those without having specific without signposting them to the specific resources. I think one of the things that in the DRG we can help with is to bring all those resources and materials into a document that will help practitioners go through all of them and use them as they see fit. I think there is an important effort of consolidation and compilation, which is currently being done. But we know that agencies have also their own initiatives, which are also very interesting to be aware of. So yeah, I see that some people would request to be in the mailing list for the DRG newsletters where we share these materials. So please write to the email address I put in the chat box, and we will add you to the mailing list. And Miriam Vester, you're asking also if you would be able to get access to all these, these links. So one of the things that we will do is to work on a little document after this event where we will add all those links, and it will be posted in the HNPW platform. So hopefully you can access those in there. Right. So maybe just spend a bit of time with some questions if people have any additional ones, or whether any of the panelists would like to share any other materials that are currently being developed. I'm thinking, for example, Ulrike, I don't want you to put you in the spot, but there is a great work that is being done through the Leave No Wine Behind project. Maybe you want to share anything that is being developed under that project in terms of materials? So Ulrike, I don't know if you're still there with us. If not, it's fine. The Leave No Wine Behind project has also a website, and we can add that into the materials when we share afterwards. All right. So if there are no additional comments, let's move then to let's say the last part of the session, in which we will move on a bit more in depth into the existing technical support mechanisms that exist to support mainstream organizations. So I'm going to hand over to Emma Pierce from WHO, who has actually been doing research on existing technical support mechanisms, and she's going to share with us some of the findings on behalf of DRG. Thank you, Emma. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Christian, and thanks to everyone for the information that has been shared so far today. There's so many great initiatives happening across the community of people working on disability inclusion in humanitarian action. What I'm going to share with you today is some work that a DRG working group undertook in 2021-2022. And the purpose of this working group was to develop a proposal for an effective model of providing technical support on disability inclusion to humanitarian actors. And the working group approached this task by first undertaking a mapping of how technical support is currently provided for throughout the humanitarian system, so that we could identify some of the lessons learned and opportunities for the DRG to consider. So today I'm going to give you an overview of that desk research that was undertaken by this DRG working group. And I hope that it might be useful in the conversation that's going to follow after my presentation. On that note, I do need to extend a big thanks to all the members of that particular working group. We had a number of UN agencies, INGOs, but also organisations of persons with disabilities that have contributed to this work. So just moving through my slides now, in terms of the objectives of the background research, our objectives were to map the technical support mechanisms already existing in the humanitarian sector, to understand the pros and cons of these different mechanisms, and to identify gaps and opportunities to strengthen technical support on disability inclusion across the sector. And we did this by conducting a series of key informant interviews with humanitarian actors that are engaged in these technical support mechanisms or projects. In total, we did 26 interviews with over 32 key informants across the sector. We also reviewed a number of project reports, case studies, and evaluations of these different technical support mechanisms. I just wanted to highlight here that we chose to focus on global humanitarian technical support mechanisms. And most of these were linked to the global cluster coordination bodies. And the reason for this is we thought that this was the level that the DRG currently operates at, and therefore would be probably modelling their technical support mechanism off. However, we did also include some supplementary global to make sure we weren't missing lessons from that group of projects as well. And this table here divide these technical support mechanisms into 3 different categories. The first category is remote technical support mechanisms, and these are most commonly in the form of help desks. So we know that a lot of the clusters, global clusters, have established a range of help desks, and these help desks have a very fast turnaround time or rapid response time for queries that come in from humanitarian actors. And essentially their purpose is to link people to practical tools, case studies, and examples. The second sort of category that we explored was humanitarian in-person support mechanisms, which are most commonly deployment mechanisms, where technical support is provided by various people with various expertise who go to country responses and support the coordination mechanism there. And of course, that can look different depending on all of the what mechanism it is. We know that there are rapid response teams in some cases, or surge teams, that will deliver, maybe 3 to 12 weeks of technical support in country. We also have standby partner secondments, which go up to, so it can be anywhere from 3 to 12 months. And then, the GenCap project, which many of you will be familiar with, now provides quite comprehensive multi-year support to country operations, usually with a 3-month inception period to develop a roadmap for the country response and how they might want to address gender issues. The third category that I've listed here in this table are what we call those disability capacity development projects. And as I said before, we know that there are a number of organisations, many of which are here today in this session, who have been running, doing technical support to the humanitarian sector in country. These are often done through a range of projects that use a combination of different techniques, among which training at field levels was most frequently cited when we explored those particular types of mechanisms. But that training is often delivered to country level coordination groups and mechanisms. So some of the key messages that we got from the people we spoke to for this desk research was, first of all, how important it is for us as the DRG to define our target for technical support. And most of the mechanisms that currently exist will be looking to support country level coordination through the clusters or the humanitarian coordination team. And a lot of them have their interagency guidelines, like our interagency disability guidelines, that they're supporting the rollout of in these countries. The key informants also stress the importance of it being seen as an interagency initiative and not associated or owned by one particular organisation. So really making it part of the wider humanitarian response, rather than it being a project that is, that is essentially aligned with or owned by a single organisation. They also suggested to us when we were talking to them that it's really important to consider both sides of supply and demand when you set up a technical support mechanism. So we might find that to start with, there is perhaps limited demand that we have to build through a range of different initiatives, a range of different awareness raising projects, but likewise, we may not have the full range of expertise and people ready to go and do in-country deployments. So we need to make sure that we consider both at the same time, so that we're building demand while delivering very good quality technical support, which of course then feeds into more demand as we move forward. And the last key message that I think came out from this piece of work was that it's really important for us to consider what the longer term, vision is or planning is for us to have a more systematic approach to country level coordination on disability inclusion. Now, as we heard earlier, you know, that from Kirsten in particular, there are working groups, there are disability focal points in many responses, but this is perhaps not, well, this is not yet, to my understanding, institutionalized within the global humanitarian response mechanism. So we might want to think about what that looks like for disability inclusion in the longer term. And this next slide here just gives you an overview of what we initially proposed through this research, which was proposed last year. So things may have changed since then. There might be new initiatives that we want to build off. But I do want to share with you what we thought could be a model for the DRG to consider. And it's a three-phase model, recognizing the importance of this phased approach that we heard from key informants in their key messages. So the first phase, many of the actions that we've defined for the first phase are actually already happening by various DRG members in the initiatives that you've already heard about today. So some of the activities that we would propose to do in the first phase could be setting up disability focal points, which can be integrated into existing help desks and community of practice mechanisms across the global clusters. Now, many global clusters already have disability focal points, so we know that this is underway, but it might be something that the DRG wants to coordinate in, in a more intensive fashion in the future. There's also the need to develop foundational tools and training. And as we've heard today, that's already underway. In fact, it's being produced. And so in many ways, we're already progressing on this particular foundational phase of technical support. And the last thing that we might want to consider doing is a little bit more of a more intensive piece of research, looking at what's working in terms of disability inclusive country coordination, mainly because this will help us to identify entry points for that longer term systematic or institutionalized approach to disability coordination. The second phase that we proposed would be where we have much more intensive in-country support available, and also a much more structured approach to the remote support. And here there were suggestions that perhaps having a global one-stop help desk or resource hub would be valuable, or a platform where all of the tools and resources that we're developing can be located and people can come and access it easily. And I think Christian's kind of alluded to that in his earlier comments, where, you know, we have all these great tools being developed. We need some way to make sure that everyone knows where to go and how to get them. And that's not to say that they can't also be in the different sectors, sector cluster help desks, but having a one-stop shop where everyone knows this is where I can get directed to the right place is by contacting this person, could be really valuable. Also in this phase, it's recommended that we start to develop a small team of roving advisors that can deliver some of that in-country technical support. And ideally, those advisors, you know, we should be thinking about how we can have more people that come from different regions with different language capacities, because I think that is a really important consideration, for later decentralization of a technical support mechanism. And lastly, in this sort of second phase, we could be developing a bit more of a roadmap for what does disability inclusion in coordination mechanisms really look like, and hopefully getting endorsement of that across the wider sector. And then the last phase is very much the longer term vision. And here it's where everything is well established and hopefully sustainably resourced. And here we might want to think about expanding to regional hubs or help desks. So that would really help for us to make sure that we're getting organizations of persons with disabilities and regional people with with contextualized experience involved in our technical support. And ideally, we would have some kind of formal approach to disability inclusive coordination in these in all responses that happen. And so the roving advisors would take on more of a role of supporting those focal points or the people coordinating the working groups to really be integrated into the wider humanitarian response. So that's the summary of the research that we undertook and where we came to. I understand that I might be handing back to Christian now to moderate a bit of a discussion about what could be the next steps, and which of these are we already doing, which ones could we maybe, are there other ideas of where we need to focus on in the future? On that note, I'll stop and hand back to you, Christian.
Great, thank you so much, Emma. Yes, indeed, and thanks a lot again for leading this research. I think it's a really good baseline to get a sense of what is out there, but what else can be done to make those technical support mechanisms more disability inclusive and maybe more fit for purpose in this particular area. And just to say that we are using in DRG this research to further inform our work plan and potentially, submit in the near future some funding proposals looking into diving a bit deeper into this particular area. I'm keen to start hearing from people on, how they are delivering technical, what initiatives they are engaged in delivering some of this technical support, specifically around disability inclusion. And I'm going to maybe hand over to Anaïs Marquette. She's from the Global Education Cluster, and she can share with us the experience of the education cluster in offering some of these technical support services. Anaïs, if you're there, please feel free to take the floor.
Thank you, Christian. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. Yes, like Christian was saying, I'm with the Global Education Cluster. I'm the Disability Inclusion Focal Point. And I thought I could start us off by mentioning a few of the gaps or challenges I've seen when it comes to technical support of cluster teams, cluster partners, in mainstreaming disability inclusion in education emergencies. So first, it's been mentioned already, but capacity strengthening of education partners, of education cluster team, especially when it comes to data. We ask a lot of cluster coordination teams, of cluster partners in terms of integrating various cross-cutting issues in their work. And a lot of the questions that come back when I offer trainings or orientations on disability inclusion in EIE are that, well, it's just added steps, extra efforts. It takes a lot of work. We already have a lot of work. How do we make this easier? And so a lot of the capacity strengthening we do is centering around what are the small steps that would allow programs to be more disability inclusive without adding a huge extra burden on the teams and on education programming actors. So that's one issue. The second one, and we've mentioned it today as well, is the OPD integration in cluster work. There has been a strong push in the past few months, the past year, to really integrate organizations of persons with disabilities into cluster activities. But there hasn't been a lot of guidance and support to cluster teams on how exactly to do that. And I've been in situations with cluster teams where they were very honest and saying, we would love to integrate them. We would love for them to participate, but to what end? What is their added value? How do we do this? Often these organizations they're not necessarily experts in EIE or in other issues like WASH or nutrition. So how do we integrate them, and how do we make sure that they have an added value for a cluster and that they get something out of it as well? So I think that's definitely an area where we could improve our support and guidance for cluster teams and cluster partners. And finally, the last one is when it comes to cost. A lot of education partners will say, fine, we can be more disability inclusive, but it costs money. And this money, we don't have it. So where we could support our teams a little bit better is also in terms of advocacy to the donor community, to donors in terms of, yes, disability inclusion, if you do it right, it might raise the cost per child. And that's fine, because what we want to do is a better disability inclusion into education programming. And if we want to get there, it might have extra costs attached, and we should advocate for that. So those are areas that I think cluster teams and cluster partners could use more guidance over.
Thanks a lot, Anaïs. Well, actually, you raise two very important points around costs and how to make sure that OPDs really participate in this in these processes of provision of of technical support. And obviously, from my point of view, it's not acceptable to say that there are no funds. We know that resourcing any kind of of technical area to make it inclusive requires to add those those costs. And yes, advocacy is important, but more so when we talk about accountability to affected populations. We know that there are at-risk groups that we cannot just leave behind for just the sake of we don't have resources. So thanks a lot for raising that. If I can just check with other speakers if they would want to react to this and maybe share some of their experiences in provision of technical support, whether they are similar or different to the experience of Anais in the education cluster. Any panelists want to take the floor?
Christian, I think Ulrike has her hand up. I'm not sure if it's an old hand.
Okay, I cannot see it. So yes, Ulrike, let's go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, and really great work, Emma, and the working group that was behind, as I understood, was quite a collaborative one. Just to add also from our end, we have an interagency project that is also currently looking at the existing disability inclusive coordination mechanisms at country level. The mapping will be shared very shortly. So what we can share already perhaps is that from the countries which have an active humanitarian needs overview and response plan, half of them only have a disability inclusive coordination mechanism. And very often these coordination mechanisms are either within the protection cluster reaching out to other clusters at the national level, or they are at inter-cluster coordination level. And of course, in those countries where it's more the refugee response, they're often connected to the working group on persons with specific needs. And we will share findings also how many of them are active in technical support at the local level. So towards the cluster members, but also towards other clusters when it goes beyond the protection cluster, and how that works. And also what we know already and what I can share to reiterate was what was mentioned by Anais. A lot of these coordination mechanisms at local level are financed by NGOs fundraising. And it depends a little bit on the capacity to fundraise by NGOs, whether these kind of mechanisms continue. And in most of them, and that's, I think, good news also, representatives of organizations of persons with disabilities are engaged in the ones where there is some of these mechanisms in place, and perhaps also considering technical support. As Emma shared, it was more like looking from the global level and the cluster as well as the help desks. As an NGO, we are also currently together with CBM International, piloting in 6 countries how to establish localized technical support mechanisms, which feed the demand of members of clusters that are implementing humanitarian response and how we can really localize technical support. It's a pilot which will end at the end of next year. So we will report. We are in the planning and reaching out stage. And for most of them, it seems that they will go away of working through the protection cluster or in adjoinment with the protection cluster or inter-cluster coordination mechanisms. That's it. We will report more on this also. And unfortunately, the report is not ready yet to be shared, but we will share through the DRG. So stay tuned on the monthly meetings.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Ulrike. That's really, really helpful. mean, one of the things I wonder, and Emma, you've presented the different mechanisms that exist as per the research you did, is how people can access or understand how those different mechanisms work, and the services that they offer. Do you have any indication of where people could potentially find such information, if it exists?
Sorry, Christian, just checking I understand your question, like where people can go to find more information about the help desk employment mechanisms that already exist.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yep. So that's through the clusters, because what we included in there were largely global cluster mechanisms. So most of the so when you see the GBV AOR help desk, if you go to the GBV AOR page, you will find a link to the help desk where there is more information about what types of services they provide and how to access those services. The other thing I wanted to, obviously with the lack of time wasn't able to cover today, is that there are also a lot of communities of practice that have been set up alongside these help desks and the more formal, I guess, cluster and AOR meetings. And those communities of practice have served to be very valuable I guess, communication mechanisms about different tools and resources, but also where to get support, where to get added technical support. So someone can write into a community of practice about a problem they're having or an issue they want to get more information on, and then be connected to the right sort of technical support mechanisms through those communities. And then you have other there are some, well, actually there's several of the mechanisms that we spoke to stress the importance also of having a really clear communication strategy when you do start to develop up a technical support mechanism, making sure that you think about how do you get information clearly and concisely out to humanitarian actors about where to get different types of support. So you'll see that in the more detailed plan that we shared with the DRG, a communication strategy was also sort of running concurrently along with the, I guess, formation or development of the technical support mechanism. I hope that helps, Christian.
Yes, no, thank you. Thank you very much, Emma. That makes things very clear. Good. I'm mindful of the time. Any other one who wants to react and share any experience? Nadia, if you're still in the call with us, it would be interesting, because the point that Anais raised around the difficulty that some actors face when involving OPDs in this type of technical support mechanisms is, it's an outstanding one. And we know that there is a parallel work that needs to be done in terms of, strengthening the capacity of OPDs and supporting them engage in the sector and be part of the decision-making processes that affect them and OPDs. But there is a huge amount of expertise in the OPDs, and I'm just wondering if in the Ukraine response through EDF you have experienced this, and if you have anything that you could share around how OPDs can support the global response, bringing technical expertise.
Well, thank you for this very important question. But the biggest problem in Ukraine was that people were in a surviving instinct. So it was very difficult to see. And also, for example, we had a lot of problems with OPDs when they wanted to protect the children in crisis situation. For example, the local legislation didn't permit foster care families, for example, to travel without a kind of permission. And so if they wanted to travel with groups, so people at that moment needed very fast, immediate technical support. So getting them engaged in policy decision-making processes at that moment was not their priority. Putting them in safety, putting them in in good condition, protecting especially children with disabilities and the people with disabilities who are left behind in those big institutions, was the biggest concern that they had at that moment. A lot of people left. So when we had donors, a lot of donors came and they tried to get involved, but they were on the staff. Staff just left. People left. So to get them involved in that moment was very hard. And this showlights how important it is to anticipate crisis situation and have emergency and evacuation plans that are inclusive, and having OPDs that have enough human capacities, but also enough funding to be sure that they stay there and that they are involved. And if the plans were made correctly with them in the beginning, so I think evacuation and involving them at the same time would have been more smoothly. It was also, there was another problem was to develop with the donors a fast tracking mechanism. No one, the government doesn't have any idea where people with disability are living, except those, even those in big institution or small institution, there was no really data to see where those people were, where we could help them with donors. So donors were there, the money was there, but how to spread it and how to find people to get those things at the right place at the right moment was very hard. And that's why it's very important also to anticipate and work on those disaster risk reduction programs and policies and humanitarian intervention from the beginning. And then train people also how to act on that moment, provide accessible information at that moment. So really having all those tools already ready to use in case of would be a big help.
Excellent, thank you very much, Nadia, for that. I see that Agnes, you've posted a comment in the chat box, which is very relevant around having this pool of experts to be able to respond to the high demand that there is in technical support. And I think well, this is a reflection that we will continue having in the DRG, and as I mentioned earlier, we really want to have a specific focus on how we strengthen these technical support mechanisms, and we're trying to look for funding around it. And part of it could be really to resource this pool of technical experts. And we know that we need to have OPDs as part of that, of that pool of experts as well. And I think the disability working groups, or the age and disability working groups that are established in some countries, and which we hope can be also a mechanism that can flourish and be extended to to other countries, can be an entry point maybe for the sector to look at that technical expertise that exists, or at least to share the information on how they can access that. All right, we have just 1 minute left. Any final reactions from anyone on this before we close? Anyone from the speakers? No? If so, well, just to thank very much again all the panelists for your contributions. I mean, we've gone through a lot of experiences today. We've shared about capacity building initiatives. Thanks Ulrike and Pauline for that, and looking forward for the good practice examples later in the year when they are released. We've heard some examples of tools that have been developed. As we said, we have a lot of tools out there, but it's important that we point practitioners to the right direction and the right places to access those tools. As we said earlier, we'll share the materials that have been shared in the chat box today, and we compile them. And again, I think these tools would be extremely useful also to look more specifically at the technical support mechanisms, like how they can resource that technical support that we know it's out there, but we need to make it more visible and support it. So thanks again very much, everyone. Thanks to the interpreters, to the captioners, and everyone who made possible this session. So have a good rest of the day, and looking forward to keep discussing the future. Thank you, everyone.